Hello, I'm Rachel and I'm recording this video in response to the question, how would you describe in your own words your mental health problem or experiences of distress? So I would say that I had a breakdown during my final year at university, but I've struggled with various kinds of mental health problems since I was probably about 14. My most problematic symptom, I guess, is self-harm, which was also the kind of earliest symptom to develop. I get very anxious and I do get quite low, but yes, self-harm and eating issues of various kinds tend to be the way that manifests itself. And I do feel suicidal a lot, and I do act on that sometimes. And that escalation to that point really started when I was in my last year at university. So I was 6 months from finals, and there was just quite a combination of factors that just became too much. And I ended up attempting suicide a couple of times, at which point I thought maybe this isn't really the time to be doing finals, and went home. Initially that was just going to be a year, and then I was going to go back, and then that became 2 years, and then it became clear that it just wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to finish my degree. So that was 3.5 years ago that I left university now, that I had that breakdown. And during that time, I've been in and out of crisis periods quite a lot. So by crisis, I mean that my suicidal thoughts become really intense, to the point where I can't really manage them safely on my own at home, and have to go into residential treatment or inpatient treatment on a ward. That used to be more or less constant, but now it tends to be, I get gaps of maybe a few months between crises. So yeah, that is my experience. So to talk about diagnosis, I've got this DIY, here's one I made earlier, teaching aid, which, I'll just show it to the camera. It's diagnosis bingo. So my diagnosis is borderline personality disorder, which is quite a controversial diagnosis, and I have really mixed feelings about it. On one level, it is really not a lot of fun. It is an insulting label to be given, and I do feel like it's gendered. Most people who are given borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis are women, and I do feel that, like 100 years ago, they would have said we were hysterical, and now they just say we've got a personality disorder. And there are large parts of the symptoms that I don't necessarily relate to. Like, I'm not massively impulsive in areas other than binge eating. I don't have psychotic episodes at all, that kind of thing. But there are parts of it that I relate to. I do struggle to identify and regulate my emotions. I do feel quite empty a lot of the time. I do have quite sudden mood changes. So I can see aspects of it that I do relate to. And also, just on a practical level, it was the only way that I was going to get any support, because where I live, there is a specialist personality disorder service. It was the only way I was going to get any kind of long-term therapy. It got me access to 2 years of dialectical behaviour therapy, though after a long wait, but that's a whole other video. So actually, when I was given the diagnosis, it was about a year after I'd left university, and I'd been in and out of crisis all of that time. And so actually I was just really relieved when someone said, this is the label you need to get help, this is the label we're giving you. So I thought, oh, okay, I don't have to manage this on my own anymore. And I also think rightly or wrongly, it's kind of seen as more severe than some other diagnoses, because you generally have to have been floating around in the system for a while before you get given it. It tends to be the box they put you in after they've run out of other boxes. And I think that in terms of getting support, like disability benefits, and I'm going back to university now and applying for disabled students allowance, I think things like that, actually it is easier with a diagnosis of personality disorder than it would be if I had the same degree of severity, but my diagnosis was something where there's a much broader range of degrees to which people struggle, like depression and anxiety. It's such a huge spectrum. I think it's quite difficult to get taken seriously where the diagnosis is quite generic. So I essentially see it as a means to an end, and I will describe myself as having borderline personality disorder in some circumstances, but not always. But I have also found it quite painful sometimes, because I do think that sometimes a diagnosis like that can be used to pathologise quite normal human reactions to things. Like, for instance, when I went onto a ward and I was put in a situation that was, wards are very stressful places, and nobody was really explaining to me what was happening, nobody was explaining anything that I needed to know, and I was really, really distressed. And I felt like, because I was a patient with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, that distress was interpreted as me having an extreme emotional reaction, because that's what people with BPD do, rather than I was having an extreme emotional reaction because I was actually in quite an extreme situation where anybody would be really frightened and potentially quite angry because you're locked in. So I think there are pros and cons to diagnosis and to that particular diagnosis. At the end of the day, it was a means to the end of getting the help that I needed. This video is in response to the question, has anything particularly helped you or made things worse along the way? And there's loads of things that I could name here, but I've limited myself to 3 of each, and there will be bits that fit into this that come up in response to other questions as well. So, number 1 on my things I've found helpful is books and reading. So when I'm really struggling, I actually find that I stop reading because I stop reading new things because I can't focus, and I just lose concentration so quickly. But because I used to read a lot before I had my breakdown, it's like I had this whole reference library of experiences and other people's experiences that I could use when I didn't have my own words. I could just find theirs, and it gave me a way in sometimes to talking about things. And I would go back and read the same things over and over again, like the same poems over and over again, or the same children's books a lot of the time, and it was just really soothing, and like I knew where it was going because I'd read it before, and it was like following a pattern that I knew really well. And I found that really comforting. And also because there's so much literature about being really frustrated with not being able to say exactly what you mean, and I relate to that a lot in terms of therapy. I just found therapy intensely frustrating a huge amount of the time, and I found it so impossible to describe my experience that it was just really reassuring to know that other people who, like, their job was words, it was their life's work, and they also found it that difficult and that frustrating to try and say what they really meant. The second thing that I found really helpful is social media, which gets a really bad rep in terms of young people's mental health. Every so often there's an article in the paper that says, oh, social media is doing terrible things to young people. But actually, if you're someone who is horrendously socially awkward in real life, then social media is a really great way of connecting with people. And when I was in hospital last time, I spent a lot of time on Twitter, and like, there are some nasty corners of Twitter, but actually there's a really large supportive mental health community online. And I wasn't really up to seeing people face to face, and I would have been very isolated. Like a lot of my friends from before I had my breakdown, I wouldn't necessarily know how to explain things to them because they wouldn't necessarily have had experiences they could relate to. Whereas with like other mental people that I chatted to on Twitter, we could actually have a laugh about some of the more absurd things that happen when you're in a mental health hospital. And it was actually really validating, and I couldn't really focus for longer than about 140 characters because I can't when I'm that unwell. So it really actually was a really helpful tool for stopping me falling into too much isolation. And the last thing that I want to say that I found really helpful is I've got 2 cats, so I'm going to try and show you. So they're both asleep at the moment, but I'll explain why they've been really helpful, and then I'll try and get them on camera. But partly I just love them a lot, but also they're kind of a way of monitoring how I'm feeling. Like if I'm feeling like I'm good for them, they're good for me, we've got this covered, then I can kind of tell that things are okay. Whereas if I'm finding myself thinking, oh, I'm not really very good for them and they'd be better off without me, and actually the things that they get from me they could get from anyone, so yeah, they'd just be better off if I wasn't here and I left them with someone else, then I know that that's a point where things are getting quite unsafe. So my cats are called Emmy and Krista. So this is Emmy. Puss. She is not impressed. Emmy. So on to the things that have made things worse along the way. Number 1 is funding issues, which everybody knows about, but specifically I think the way that the messages are sent to service users about funding issues is really problematic and makes things a lot more painful. So I used to have a day centre that I went to that had its funding cut by half, and the message we were given was, this service is changing and there are financial problems, but actually it's mostly about creating services which are recovery focused and which are not encouraging dependency, which I think is a really, really blaming word, because everyone depends on something. Nobody wants to be depending on mental health services. We would all like to be out there living our independent lives. Well, independence is a myth, but we would all like to be out there rather than in services. And I think it's like victim blaming. Like, it's telling us that if services can't meet our needs, then that's because our needs are wrong rather than because the resources aren't there. And I think that makes it so much more damaging than it needs to be. And if they had just said to us, we would love to run your services that has been run, but our funding's been cut and we can't, and we're sorry, then I would have been able to handle that. But I couldn't handle the message that I was sent about it. The second thing is the way that, particularly when I first came into services, the way that people engaged with my family. So I was relatively young when I had my breakdown. I was 22, and I think that because I was young and I lived with my family, people automatically assumed that I wanted them completely involved. And when I found the way that they acted unhelpful, I was often told that they would respond in a more helpful way if I communicated better with them. And there was a lot of eagerness to get them in for meetings and to tell them everything about me and my risk level and how things were with me. And actually, I love my family to bits, but what I desperately needed was space from them and space to myself, and to feel like there was someone who was there just for me. And I kind of ended up feeling like the people who were supposed to be taking care of me actually were taking care of my family's feelings first, and that was really difficult and made it a lot harder to engage with the services that I kind of needed. And the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of things which have made things worse is austerity, basically, and specifically things like welfare benefit cuts and benefits assessments. And because I think that the process of assessment for personal independence payments, which is like disability benefits, it forces you to fit your problems into somebody else's boxes in a way that's really hard. And for me, one of my big anxieties is that I tend to tell myself that my problems aren't really real, and that it's like imposter syndrome, like I've just made all this up in my head, and actually if I just tried a little bit harder then probably I'd be fine, and if I can do one thing then why can't I do these other things. And the way that the assessment process for benefits is set up, it precisely mirrors those insecurities. So it's been quite a big trigger for crises for me and for quite a few people that I know. Goldilocks and the Three Therapists, a thinly veiled autobiography by Rachel Rowan Olive. Goldilocks was sad and frightened. Goldilocks had been sad and frightened for a long time, but it was starting to frighten her how sad and frightened she was, so she decided to see a doctor. The doctor sent her to see a therapist, but the therapist wouldn't help. After a while, because she was becoming more and more sad and more frightened, the doctor sent Goldilocks to see another therapist. But this therapist wouldn't help either. This made Goldilocks more sad and frightened than ever. Eventually, the doctor sent Goldilocks to see a third therapist. By this time, Goldilocks was so sad and frightened that she thought she might die from it. This therapist said they would help. The end. Actually, the beginning of a long and extremely frustrating, tiring, difficult, boring, but mostly worth it process of changing her entire way of being, which Goldilocks will never entirely complete. So, as you can probably tell from that, a lot of my experience with mental health services has been quite coloured by how difficult it can be to access them in the first place, because the long waiting lists and the having to fit specific criteria and just the pressure on services that you're so aware of makes it a lot hard to engage once you eventually do get some help. And it also leads to this fear that if you don't engage in the right way, or you don't make yourself easy enough to help, then you're going to be discharged and left on your own, which is a really unhelpful basis for a therapeutic relationship. So that's one thing. But I also wanted to talk about the way that different services have responded to self-harm, which I do touch on in another video, but I want to talk about it in a bit more detail. I've accessed quite a lot of different services, from very short-term acute inpatient to 2 years of dialectical behaviour therapy in the community. So I've had quite a lot of different responses to self-harm in those different services, and even within one service, sometimes people respond in very different ways. And I've thought a lot about what's helpful and what isn't, and I think responses can sometimes, they can range from quite punitive, which I felt in wards, where the response tends to be to restrict your freedom if you are at risk of self-harm. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's the kind of just ignore it approach, which I think I live in a supported housing project, and I think they've adopted that approach, and it's been really actively quite unhelpful, because it just has meant that I've been really at risk and they've not responded at all. And I think that both of those are really bad. There is a response somewhere in the middle, which is able to say, I don't want you to be doing this. We don't want you to be doing this to yourself. Let's look at ways that you can work around and work through the need to do it. Let's set boundaries for what is manageable in a particular context. So the women's crisis house that I've been to, I sat down with them and worked out a list of what they could manage in that environment and what actually was more risk than they could handle. And doesn't say it's okay for you to hurt yourself, because that can be quite a bad message to send as well, but also accepts that it serves a lot of purposes and it isn't possible to just stop. That's not a reasonable demand to make of anybody. I've been self-harming since I was 14. I can't just stop. If I could, I would have done by now. So yeah, I think that kind of somewhere in the middle approach is really important. And yeah, I think it's quite rare to actually find it, because I think sometimes staff really struggle to manage their own anxieties around self-harm. Like I would, but that's one of the many reasons why I'm not a mental health support worker. Like I would be very afraid of someone who was in my care hurting themselves. But I think that staff need to be able to hold on to their own emotions about it and not project them onto service users, either by restricting their freedom or by showing frustration, which does happen, or by just seeing it as attention seeking and saying, oh well, in that case the best thing to do is ignore it, because otherwise it encourages the behaviour, which is an approach that you find sometimes. The last thing that I wanted to say about it was that obviously it's really different for different people, and I think being open about the fact that it serves a lot of different purposes for a lot of different people, and there isn't one approach that's going to work for everyone, but also there isn't any one solution. There might not be anything which does what self-harm does for people. Like when I first saw a psychologist, I made this huge great mind map of all of the functions that self-harm serves for me. Like, well, I'm not going to go into them because they're quite personal, but and she looked me in the eye and she said, there probably isn't anything that is going to do all of these things, but there might be things that do one or two of these things that might be enough, and you might not get all of the benefits, I'm hesitant to use that word, that self-harm gives you with an alternative, but it'll have the major benefit that you won't be hurting yourself. So I think being honest about that and being clear about the different things it does for different people, and not assuming that it serves the same purpose for everyone, that it's always impulsive, that it's always a response to immediate high emotion. I think acknowledging that's really important, and that's something that the services that have been able to do that they're the ones that have really made a difference to me. So this video is, what advice would you give to a psychologist trying to help someone with your kind of experiences? And I'm going to count down from 5, like an award. Number 5 is be ready to have a laugh with your clients, because sometimes really funny things happen in quite inappropriate situations and you really just have to laugh. And also because it's, for me, taking the piss a bit is kind of a way of taking what is, like, letting me take what's useful from the system while distancing myself from the bits that really aren't very helpful. And I do that through drawing quite silly cartoons about mental health. And when I first started drawing those, it was in an art therapy group, and I thought that the therapist was gonna just, like, I was kind of waiting for her to tell me off. I think that was part of it. I was kind of challenging her and seeing how far I could push it. And then when she didn't tell me to sit down and do some proper work, then that was like, that broke through a bit of a barrier. That was really when I started to actually engage and trust her, when I saw that she actually kind of got my humour. So that's quite important. Number 4, meet people where they're at before trying to move them forwards. Like, so what I mean by that is, when I'm feeling really hopeless and like there is just nothing that's going to make it better, like sometimes all of the skills that you can learn to regulate your emotions and all of the things that you can try, just sometimes none of them work. And sometimes what I need in that situation is someone to say, I know this is shit and I know that you don't feel like anything is going to get any better, and to acknowledge that and hold that hopelessness and just let me feel that way if that's where things are, before pushing me to change it if I'm not ready to. So number 3, advocate for your clients personally and politically. So on a personal level, you hear a lot when you spend a lot of time floating around the mental health system about service user involvement and people being engaged in their own care, and people like co-production, people co-producing care plans. But there is a massive power imbalance between people using services and people providing them. And even though people providing services might also be using them in another context, and people using services might also be providing them in another context, when you are in the role of service user, you have so little power. And the weight of the words of the professionals working with you, my experience is that will always carry more weight than the words I use about myself. I think sometimes I need my care coordinator, who is a psychologist, to advocate for me. And I also think, in political terms, I spend a lot of time on activism and on pushing for things like the benefit system to be less excruciatingly painful and humiliating, and for services to be more effective and to take account of people's needs more. And I'm happy to do that. That's part of who I am and part of who I want to be. But it is very, very tiring. And if it's only service users saying those things, we're a lot more easy to dismiss than if it's an alliance of service users and professionals. So yeah, I think I find it quite difficult to trust people who don't see that, and who will sort of be like, oh well, politics is not really my job, because I don't think you can separate them. Number 2 is not very easy, but it's acknowledge the harm that's sometimes done by the system that you work in. That's if you end up working in the NHS. Obviously, I owe the NHS my life probably about 12 times over at this point, and I know that, and I'm grateful for that most of the time. But I have also been really damaged by some of the treatment that I've had, some of the way that I've been handled when I've been in crisis and I've been taken to A&E by the police, for instance. Some of the experiences I've had in A&E have been horrific. I've been stitched up without anaesthetic. I've been physically restrained by 2 big male security guards when I was no threat to anyone. And that does impact how I engage with other people who are saying they're there to help me, because the police said they were there to help me, the security guards said they were there to help me, the doctor who stitched me up without anaesthetic said he was there to help me. And if my therapist and then the psychologist who I see now hadn't been able to acknowledge that they were part of a system that had really, really hurt me, I wouldn't have been able to move forward. So I think that's very important. And number one, this is my absolute number one bugbear, is don't assume you're entitled to your client's trust. I, less so now, but when I first came into services, I found it really, really difficult to talk. And a lot of the time, I knew that I needed help, but I would end up just sitting in silence. I just couldn't get the words out. And sometimes that's something that people find really difficult to get their heads around, and they'll kind of become quite frustrated and say, oh, well, if you don't talk to me, I can't help you, which to me, that doesn't feel like anything other than an ultimatum, like be helped on our terms or stop wasting our time, basically. But you might know you're there to help me, but not everyone who's said they're there to help me in my life has really been on my side. And that's likely to be the case for most people who've ended up in mental health services. So I think acknowledging that you can see how hard it is for someone if they're not talking, and that it's hard to trust a stranger and to give up your story when that might be the only thing you've ever had ownership over, and the only space you've ever had is how you describe yourself and how you tell your story of who you are and how you've come to be who you are. And to trust someone enough to just pour that out, that doesn't happen just because they're wearing an NHS lanyard. So I think it's really, really important to allow people not to trust you straight away. And in my experience, the people who don't assume that they are entitled to my trust are the ones who I've ended up trusting, and the ones who feel that I'm slighting them by not trusting them are the ones who it generally hasn't been worth trusting. So that's my advice. Not going to be the case for everybody, but those are my experiences. This video is how has gender affected your experiences of mental health? So in my area, there's a women's crisis house, which is like a direct alternative to hospital admission for women who are in a mental health crisis. And every time they have an assessment, they ask whether the woman they're assessing has ever been abused, either sexually, physically, or emotionally. And the overwhelming majority of women say yes. And I think that actually pretty much all women have experienced some kind of sexual or gendered violence, even if we don't always identify it as abuse, because it's on a spectrum. Like street harassment is related to sexual abuse because it's all about power. And the first 7 or 8 times that I was asked that question, like my first 7 or 8 assessments there, I said no, but I changed my answer the last time I stayed there. I'd kind of always thought that my experiences of sexual violence were within the range of normal, and that they were kind of somehow acceptable because of that, because they were just, oh well, everyone's had that. But then I was writing a blog about gender and mental health, and I wrote down something that I remembered happening to me when I was very young, and it suddenly dawned on me that if it had happened to anybody else, I would call it abuse. But actually, even if what I'd experienced, just the everyday sexisms that pretty much all women go through, even if they were within the range of normal, then I think they would still be enough to mean that when I'm in crisis and I'm frightened, I'm more frightened of men, especially men who I don't know. But the default for mental health services is that they're mixed gender in terms of both the staff and the service users. And you have to push quite hard to be admitted to a single gender ward or service. And the tendency is to wait until something goes wrong and then fix it, like admit a woman to a mixed gender ward, and then if she's clearly frightened of men, move her to a single gender one. Whereas actually it would be possible to get it right first time if services were commissioned on the assumption that women who are frightened are more frightened of men. And so during my last crisis, I consented to go into hospital if I could be admitted to a single gender ward, but there were no beds for 4 days, and I ended up being sectioned by the police because I wouldn't consent to go to a mixed ward. But then that meant I was at home for 4 days when I was really unsafe, and I ended up trying to jump off a bridge. So yeah, the resources just aren't there. Services aren't commissioned to meet people's gender-related needs. And actually in my area, there are a lot more resources than there are in most. So I wrote a piece last year about the different experiences of staying at a women's service that's run by women and being on mixed gender wards. And I'm going to read that out because sometimes these things are quite difficult to think about, so it's easier if I can read from something I've written than just talking. I don't like strange men watching me sleep. Most women wouldn't, but women in mental health crisis often have to deal with it during the most frightening periods of our lives. Last September, I was in hospital after a suicide attempt, and I was put on one-to-one observation as I was deemed a high risk to myself. This meant that someone was allocated to monitor me at all times. On day 2 of my admission, that person was a man. I hated knowing that if I took too long in the bathroom, which I wasn't allowed to lock, a man I didn't know might come in. I panicked. I unhooked my drip and tried to run away. The doctors did not think this was a good idea. I was sectioned. In April, I was put on one-to-one observation on a mental health ward with a male member of staff. On those wards, the doors are locked. I couldn't bolt, so I curled up in a ball and screamed. Maybe this makes me seem mad, but at the time, it felt like the only possible response to being trapped on a corridor of strangers at night where a man I didn't know was going to watch me sleep. These experiences are a world apart from my stays at Drayton Park Women's Crisis House, a residential alternative to hospital for women in mental health crisis. There, nobody is ever locked in and only women work there. The staff still check on residents regularly, but I knew that the person knocking on my bedroom door at midnight would always be a woman, so I wasn't humiliated or frightened. And the checks were accompanied by intensive therapeutic work, usually 2 individual sessions a day, so I felt contained rather than controlled. In mixed gender residential services, I hardly left my room because I got unwanted attention from the male patients. But the more time I spent alone, the further my thoughts could run away with me. At Drayton Park, I had spaces to sit with other women without fear of harassment. It also helped that it's a normal house. The bedding isn't mint green hospital blankets and the floors are carpeted. These things make a difference. Cold, clinical environments where all the cutlery is plastic and every surface is wiped clean don't lift anyone's mood. As a women's service, Drayton Park have also had to develop robust policies around self-harm, as it affects significantly more women than men. They spoke to me openly about it from the start, accepted that I might not be able to stop completely, and worked with me to manage the risk. On the wards, the staff searched my room and I always found ways to hurt myself. At Drayton Park, I learned to trust them enough to hand in anything I wasn't safe to have. It was the first residential service where I didn't feel judged or punished for wanting to self-harm. This gave me the freedom to say when I was struggling, and so gradually I learned other ways to cope. There's plenty of discussion in mental health around safety, but very little about what makes people feel safe. I think the best way to keep people physically safe, and the only way to make that safety sustainable once we go home, is to develop a relationship with staff where we feel safe emotionally. It's no coincidence that the only crisis service where I have felt that is run by women for women. So for this last video, I'm going to talk about art and the way that that's had a really big impact on my mental health, because I never really thought of myself as an arty person before I had a breakdown, and now it's my job, at least some of the time, and even when it's not my job, it's quite a big part of my life. So I came to art through art therapy at this day hospital where I spent a lot of time in the kind of immediate aftermath of my breakdown. And there was an art therapy group there, and there was also a pottery group there, and I think clay's been really significant actually, because clay just kind of works magic with mental health. There's something really grounding about it, the fact that you're just literally making stuff out of mud, and the texture of it, and you can just, I used to just sit there and sort of sulkily poke some clay around for about an hour and a half, but it did help in a funny way. And with the kind of drawings type art, I think I just reached a point where I was like, well, I'm crap at everything else, so I may as well give this a go and be crap at this too. And actually, I sort of found a way through being crap at it to just accepting and letting myself screw it up and keep going. And now I go to this art studio, which is like a therapeutic community, but based around art, twice a week, and it's great. I mean, it's hard, but it makes a huge difference to my mental health. So I'm gonna show some pictures of some of my sketchbooks from different points over the last few years, and then I'm going to talk through a couple of projects. One is a finished project, which is a book that I've produced called A is for Awkward, which is the stick figure cartoons that I first did when I first started doing art stuff. And the second one is one that's still a work in progress, called The Book of Hands, which is also going to be about my experiences of mental health, but just expressing them in a slightly different way. One of the things that was really helpful about art was that I could make a mess and just not try and do anything that looked like anything, or I could just experience the colours and enjoy them for what they were. And I think a big part of that was the fact that I made the books myself. Like, I'd physically made this space for myself that I could use however I wanted, and if it was a mess or not good by other people's standards, that was fine. I have what could politely be described as a difficult relationship with my body. A lot of my problems are played out quite physically, and I think drawing sort of isolated parts of myself can be quite helpful with that, in that it kind of lets me just see a part of myself as just another object that I'm drawing, and I just have to focus on the physical shape of it and the lines and the spaces, and not put so many judgments on there. One of the things that I have always liked to do when I am struggling to find my own inspiration, to know what to draw, is to use other people's words that I've loved as a starting point. And so this is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. And this one is a quote from Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, apart from the Why Aren't I Normal? Yeah, that's my addition. This is actually kind of a throwaway line in the play, but I find it really, that feeling of just doing things for the sake of passing the time and it all feeling like it doesn't really mean anything when I'm not in a great place. It's kind of how it feels. And it's quite good that someone else has written it down already. So this is A is for Awkward, and I'm just going to let it play and hopefully speak for itself. So this is the Book of Hands, which is very much a work in progress. I'm going to read through the text that is going to go with the images eventually. When I first painted, I painted with my hands. I was trying to annoy the art therapist by making as big a mess as possible. It backfired. Art therapists love mess. When I was angry, I showed it with my hands. I held my own life in my hands, and I almost let it go. There are days when I think if I touch my hand to paper, it will ignite. In sign language, you say sorry by making a fist and moving it in circles over your chest. Your hand is the same shape for violence and apology. When I learn to live with myself, I think it will begin in my hands, spreading backwards from my fingertips.